So I've decided to make a video explaining some ideas that I just released in a long blog post, which I'll put in the description. Try to summarize and expand on some of the ideas to a certain extent. So one of the clips from Peterson that stuck around with me for a long time was when he speaks about God's curse on the woman in Genesis of great difficulty in childbearing. And he connects this to an evolutionary arms race between the size of the woman's hips and the baby's head. And he's mentioned other places as well that gestationally humans are born incredibly immature, that if they were to reach a level of competency comparable to other animals of a similar size, other mammals, they would the gestation period would probably be like 2 years. So when a baby is a toddler, like they would emerge as a toddler, they could walk around on their own. That would be more typical. If you think about horses and cows, their babies can stand up within a few hours. And even our closest evolutionary ancestors, as they say, the chimpanzees, the gorillas, other large apes like that, their infants are born dependent and vulnerable, but it's only about a few days. It's a few days, and then like a baby chimpanzee they have enough grip strength to hold on to their mother's fur. And I think Peterson brings these things up because I think that he's seeing that there's something profound in there that he's wrestling with. Because that gap between the capability of a human infant and like a chimpanzee is so vast that to place it in terms of an evolutionary arms race is very difficult, because you would need either there would have to be a lot of steps in between, very gradual, or it's like it happened overnight, kind of like what the biblical account says. And so I was thinking about this, especially in terms of recent discussion where people have had questions about our love for our natural relations, or our natural affections, as you will, versus like the Christian commandment to love your neighbor, love your enemies, love others. And as I was thinking about this, and I've thought about this before in the past, but it's become more of a profound thought, and I really did a little bit of research and worked it out, especially in comparison to the other chimps and things like that. But even these so-called like natural affections of humans for our closest relatives are really learned. Some of this probably comes through the production of oxytocin. That's like the bonding love hormone. You get it with your dog. When you stare into the eyes of your dog, you both experience a boost in oxytocin. And this happens between parents and children as well, and other affectionate family kin groups. Now, there's limits to how powerful this oxytocin is. For instance, it can be overridden even on the part of a mother. We like to think that the mother's love for her child is this innately powerful thing, which I think it is. But, if you hear the stories of women who are addicted to drugs, their addiction to dopamine or whatever opioid type pleasure response is so powerful that there's many, many tragic stories of women who have abandoned their children, or some grievous harm has come to their children while they're passed out on drugs. So the oxytocin bond is not the most powerful thing, and that's probably good in some ways, because what Sapolsky talks about on some of his talks is that it bonds people together, with their kin group, with the people you're close to, but that actually increases your dislike for those who are the other. So in that way, there is a tension between the natural affections of family and friends and kinship and the love of neighbor, love of the stranger, love of the enemy. Which, that's why we need divine love to help us overcome that deficit. Now, I think there's another powerful attraction in there where the attraction between men and women can transcend that bond quite easily. And it happens. And it almost happens. That is almost a biological thing that happens unconsciously. People find that they're often very attracted to someone with a very disparate set of genes. But as I was thinking about this story in Genesis and the way it kind of plays out, it says it like as a curse, and we take that to mean bad thing. But what God's doing when he says that this is a curse or whatever, he's putting a limit, a boundary on this situation. He's changed the way that women are going to give birth in the future. And it's going to be this thing where the spacing of the head and the width of a woman's whips are very close, and many women lose their children in childbearing, much more so than other species of animals. And the human infant is born in this incredibly needy state. And I think that in some ways, it definitely teaches the parent. The parent learns through this experience of their own frailty, because they see this child, and this child is helpless, and its cries for help affect us, and we do have that stirring of the oxytocin, and you begin to care for the child, you care for his needs, and then your affections grow. And this is, the bond that grows between parents and children. So even those natural affections are really learned in some sense. And there's something that stands in opposition to it, which is the other consequence of the fall, the will, I guess you could say. And Peterson mentioned this in another place where he talked about how they can listen to the cries of babies and the ways that they differ, and they can look at the video camera, look at their facial expressions. And they noticed that if a baby was crying and the father went into the room in certain circumstance or whatever, while the baby was expecting the mother, the baby's response is anger. It's angry that the wrong parent showed up. It's angry that it did not get its way. And babies can do some crazy things. Kids too, their will. Sometimes you'll have these kids, they'll be determined and they're angry at their parents, and they'll just hold their breath until their face turns blue, because the desire that they have to be in charge and to be in control, it's in there. They don't have to be learned. They don't have to be taught that. And essentially what parenting does is it brings that will into relationship with reality. Because if you don't parent your children, you give them whatever they want all the time, you ruin them, you spoil them, you create entitled jerks that are not kind, they're not loving. And if they eventually come to a place where they discover the truth of that much later in life, if circumstance deals them a harsh hand, it's a far more difficult process to overcome and unlearn those bad habits. So a parent's love including the boundaries and the limitations they put on it, is meant to teach the child that they are not in control, that they are not the master of the universe. And if you think about it, gestationally, there's nothing that happens within the womb that would ever disabuse them of that notion. So the fact that children are born early, it teaches the child, it gets the child into a proper understanding of reality much quicker than if they, were born and they were already like walking and talking or something like that. A child whose untested experience, if you essentially give a child everything that they want up until that point, you can ruin them. And Peterson even says, it's by like the age of 4, if a kid isn't socialized enough to learn not to hit and kick, and especially if it's a boy, that's like the highest predictor for a criminal lifestyle. So on the one hand, being born too early is a good thing for the child. It teaches the child their need to rely on others, their frailty. On the other hand, it teaches the parents, in retrospect, they can learn that about themselves. The child learns it by being socialized. They learn it on this kind of unconscious level, but they don't have the full depth of experience. And in one sense, if you want to think about evolution, natural selection, all of us are descended from the parents who valued and cared for their children. And there's been many, 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 many more children throughout history who, either intentionally or through tragic circumstances, perished as infants or young children, and all of their genes were not passed on. And those children, I see very clearly that there's not much we need to worry about the eternal state of their soul or anything like that. I think because, it says whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And those babies, even if they may start with a reaction of anger towards an uncomfortable circumstance, their helplessness, their neediness is going to put them to a point of desperation. And if you think about these children that were abandoned like trash heaps in the ancient world, and they're just crying out for water, for food. Their cry has an essential meaning that transcends words. It's for food, it's for water. Well, who is Jesus? He is the living water. He's the bread of life. And so they cry out for that, and ultimately, if denied it in their physical reality, I would say, you could even say that is an experience of faith, because that's what the baby has. The baby is pure faith. It cries in an act of pure faith, expecting to be answered. And if people don't, then I believe God does. And, you could even say, even if our minds don't always act that way, our bodies do. And I think of Cain and Abel, and that the blood spilt, the blood cries forth. Because what happens when you cut someone, the blood in your body rushes to that wound and tries to heal it and close it off and sustain life. And if you may feel nihilistic and apathetic, but if you cut yourself, your blood doesn't feel that way. If it does, you're a vampire. If your blood just stays where it is and doesn't flow. And so this is the interesting thing, is that there's a solution that God gives to Adam and Eve for this circumstance. He provides a way for them, and this is the garments of skin. I really dislike, and I think it's absolutely wrong, kind of the Pageauian negative view of the garments of skin. In that story, there is a negative solution. Adam and Eve tried to make these fig leaf aprons, and God removes those. That was man trying to be self-sufficient, and the answer is that he's not. He cannot provide for himself. He needs somebody to provide for him. just as he is as an infant. Ultimately, we are always relying on God. You know, when we seek to breathe, you know, when your lungs are gasping for air, you're searching for spirit, for ruach, for the breath of God. And God knows the number of our breaths. That's not something that we have control over, no matter how much we might think we do. You know, like that guy, Brian Johnson. He thinks he's extending his life, but God already knows how many days and how many breaths he has. So the fig leaf apron was not the correct solution, but the garments of skin are provided by God. And that word is actually the word for those garments of skin. The only other place it's used in Genesis is when Jacob, Israel, gives the coat to his son Joseph. And it's a sign of chosenness, a sign of authority. It's a restoration to their original role. Not in the garden. They're expelled from the garden for the same reason that a baby is expelled from the Edenic womb of its mother, because it's no longer the correct environment for them to learn what they need to learn. And what they need to learn is that God is the source and we are dependent on him. We're not our own masters. We're not our own gods. We're not in control of our own lives. So God sends them out of the garden, but he provides them with these garments of skin. And throughout human culture, like, a human baby is so helpless. You know, they can't even hold up their own neck. They can't crawl for several months. If you put them down somewhere, they're, the mother needs to stay nearby to keep that baby safe. Otherwise, if you think about like a human animal, a naked human animal, she's got to use one or both, probably both her arms most of the time to keep that baby secure, which limits her ability to provide for herself, to find food to feed herself and all those things. But in giving the woman and the man these garments of skin, God essentially is giving them a technological means of turning them into something like transhumanist marsupials. Because if Eve has a garment, what's a woman do with her newborn infant? She keeps it close to her skin, because babies can't even regulate their own temperatures. And unless if you're in a place where it's like 98 degrees, that baby will either get too hot or too cold in an environment, and so they need to be skin to skin. And so God gives the woman this technological means, essentially, to secure the baby to herself. And essentially, that is like the creation of culture. It's this invented, created solution to fixing a problem, a biological problem, of the problem of children being born too soon. And that I think that's something you will find throughout history, throughout all histories and all cultures. You will find some sort of thing like that. Even in the places where women and men don't really wear clothes because it's hot, they still need to secure the baby to themselves in some ways to keep it safe and to keep it secure. And even we have that in the incarnation, where Jesus is wrapped in swaddling cloths. So even to be placed in the manger, because, like I said, a baby's temperature needs something. They need to be kept warm. They can't regulate their own temperature in the right way. And all these things are teaching us these lessons of dependency and our connection to God and our dependence on one another. And so the reason why I thought this was really important was because to go back to kind of the people that were criticizing some of the stuff J.D. Vance said, the order of loves and all those things. It is so good to love your neighbor. It's so wonderful that people do that. The fact that Christians would, in the early days of the early church, they would go to these trash heaps where people were abandoning their children, and they would take them and adopt them is amazing. And in some sense, they've resurrected a branch of humanity that wasn't intended to live. The problem is we forget the suffering. We forget the suffering of our relatives from whom we did not descend. And many of them learned that lesson of our frailty and our need far more than we do. We took for granted what our parents give us. And this is important because all of those loves for stranger, for the enemy, for your neighbor, whatever, they all spring out of that basic love that comes from a mother caring for her child and a father who protects the woman and provides for them. And that's even, what you see in Christ, in his coming, in the incarnation, because what is the gift? What is the gift? It's that God gave his only begotten Son. Everything is based in that parental relationship first. And when we love somebody who is not our family, not our friend, not our neighbor, or no natural relation, we're doing that out of an understanding, out of a reflection. It's the antithesis of what we do know and we do understand. And so we have to guard and protect that primary relationship. But we also have to realize that even those most primary relationships that we call a natural affection is not a natural affection. All parents who raise their children are doing it in a sacrificial way. And this is even to say when you hear these people talk about, like, how could you be so selfish to bring a child into this world, or if you truly care about humanity, you wouldn't seek to have a large family because of climate change. When I became a father, I realized that those were all malicious lies, and they were all selfish, because as soon as I was responsible for this child, I knew that this is the means through which love and compassion grows. And so if you want to have people who love their neighbors, who love the stranger, the outcast, who love their enemy, the only way you learn those skills of love is through your relation to those first relationships, the natural love between a parent and child. And you learn it either because you did have it or because you didn't. If you did have it, you want to foster that pattern and repeat it. If you didn't have it, if you had bad parents, if you were adopted, or if you were, which is to say, abandoned by your natural parents, you should have children so that you can love them better than your parents did. And if you begin there, then you will realize, I don't want this child to be selfish. I don't want them to think that they're the center of the universe. So I need to show them how to love sacrificially towards others. And this is the way that the gospel and the kingdom of God are meant to spread. So those are my thoughts. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.